Welcome back to State of Belief Radio. I'm Welton Gaddy. At its best, our political system serves as an expression of American values, both individual and collective. Far too often, however, values rhetoric, and with it, religious rhetoric, gets dragged into the kinds of conflicts that have led to political gridlock in recent years. What are the pitfalls, and what would it look like if both the right and left in this country adhered more closely to the intentions of the founders? Charles Haynes is the founding director of the Religious Freedom Center in Washington, D.C., and Charles recently addressed these issues in an article headlined Republicans, Democrats, and the Stakes for Religious Freedom. Charles Haynes is a longtime friend. He has worked with Interfaith Alliance tirelessly. Cooperation is always enjoyable. And so I am delighted to take this opportunity to have Charles back on our show today. Charles Haynes, welcome back to State of Belief Radio.
Well, it's so good to be with you. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work you've been doing all these years.
You know, I guess I can't avoid the temptation, because when I talk with my friends back in Washington, my first question usually is, have you been able to stay sane during this election cycle?
Well, I laugh, but it's really not funny.
Right.
It's really one of the, most disheartening times in my lifetime, if not the most, in political life. So, I'm trying to, as we all are, sort of keep our focus on our first principles, trying to look to the best in our country, and just hope that the American people can rise to this occasion.
Well, Charles, that the topics that you're interested in are topics that we're interested in, have been all along. But your framing of both the problem and some ways to improve the situation, and both succinct and articulate, it is just superb. And it was important for us that we have you on the show. Would you start by summarizing what both sides are getting wrong as you see it?
Well, thank you. That's kind of you. As I see it, I think that both sides are cherry-picking, really, the First Amendment. And we need to do better than that. Especially the religious liberty principles are two principles for one freedom. No establishment and free exercise equals liberty of conscience for every human being. So we can't really emphasize no establishment without taking into account freedom of conscience and protecting that. And we can't go over there and emphasize free exercise of religion, but not pay attention to the very condition that supports religious freedom, and that is separating church from state. So I would say on the left, sometimes there is a tone deafness to claims of conscience. Not whether these claims should win or not, or prevail, or, that's a good discussion to have in each case. But just in the first place to say, when people have a religious claim of conscience, we take it seriously in the United States. And sometimes I think on the left, for some good reasons, those claims are not being listened to as they should be. And on the other side, on the right, it seems to me that the Establishment Clause has been forgotten. And the Establishment Clause is what got folks on the right to the fortunate place they're in, to have a voice in the public square. I mean, if we didn't have this arrangement in separating church from state, they would not have the freedom to participate in the public square as they do. And we are so fortunate in this country. It's probably the most important principle we've given to world civilization, is to really have a government that is neutral among religions and between religion and non-religion. And I think on the right, that important condition for freedom of conscience has been neglected and forgotten.
Charles, would you say the problem has been getting worse in recent years?
Yes, I think that we are victims of the culture wars, as you know, Weldon. I mean, I think and shouting past one another in the culture wars, particularly over LGBT rights and religious freedom issues, that shouting match and that fight of state to state and nationally has really poisoned the well for talking about religious freedom in a way that can bring us together. And there's plenty of blame to go around. I would say that people who advocate for religious freedom but forget about the need to protect fundamental rights for all people, including LGBT people, are partly responsible for this poisoning of the well. But at the same time, LGBT advocates need to keep in mind that as we uphold non-discrimination and struggle for full equality, we also need to protect religious conscience as far as we can. So I think there's blame to go around. But this is getting worse and worse because people are taking sides in a way that is, frankly, beginning to demonize the other side.
Not to be cynical, but how much of this is likely to be coming from deeply held convictions, and how much might be politically motivated manipulation?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's a mix, of course, as it always is in the political arena. I would say that many religious leaders and political leaders are taking advantage of this situation and beating the drum for their agenda, knowing that it's going to resonate with people on other levels. And so I think that is a very manipulative way to go and is harmful to religious freedom. So, yes, I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, using this moment. For example, the reaction against American Muslims and Islam in general is an opportunity for some who have long harbored an animus towards Islam and Muslims. This whole conversation is their opportunity to demonize Islam, even as they frame it as fighting against terrorism. So I think there's a lot of taking advantage of this situation, and that's been dangerous for religious freedom.
In your article, you zero in on Islamophobia. And in fact, you call it the great religious freedom test of our time. I wish you'd talk about that a little more in the context of both history and in today's political rhetoric.
Sure. I think it's important for Americans to remember their history and to know that when we are faced with a new challenge, and as certainly the growth of Islam in the United States, and especially in the context of this world situation where people are, in the name of Islam, doing terrible things, they are really anti-Muslims. It's the anti-Islamic state. But nevertheless, what they've done is given people fuel, ammunition in this country to demonize Islam and Muslims in the name of fighting terrorism, which is wrong. But the challenge comes when we're faced with this. How are we going to react as a people? We did badly, frankly, in the 19th century for decades in treating Catholics in a terrible way with prejudice and discrimination, and passing laws to limit the freedoms, trying to limit the freedoms of Catholics, keep them from being citizens. I mean, convents were burned and riots, and it was a terrible time. We forget that. And that's not who we need to be now. And if we go through that all again and forget that we're the haven for the cause of conscience in the United States. We protect the rights of people, even those we deeply disagree with. That's on our best days who we are. And we failed to do that in the past with Mormons and with Catholics, and to a great extent with Jehovah's Witnesses, who've been to the Supreme Court more than 50 times to try to get their freedom protected. So, we've had a struggle in this country to live up to this ideal of religious freedom for all, a level playing field for all. And suddenly, American Muslims are being targeted, and we forget that when we do that, we do it for ourselves. Because today it's Muslims or Sikhs or others, and tomorrow it could be our group that's targeted.
Charles, I read you as saying both political parties should be equally invested in preventing religious bigotry, even if only out of self-interest. Is that a fair interpretation?
Absolutely. I mean, it's both parties say they're for religious freedom, but it's time now to be clear what religious freedom is and isn't. And to be for religious freedom and at the same time encourage Islamophobia. And I have to say that in the primary season on the Republican side, the Islamophobia coming from many candidates, not just Donald Trump, led to a spike in attacks on Muslims and Muslim institutions in this country. This has been well documented. Mm-hmm. This is clear connection between rhetoric and speech and hate and actual damage to people's lives. So to be the party that stands for religious freedom, which is what the Republican Party says it is, they need to understand that's not just religious freedom for the Christians or the Christians they like. It's religious freedom for everyone, including faith groups that they disagree with or that they find offensive. The rights of all have to be defended. Now, on the Democratic side, of course, there's a great emphasis on protecting the rights of American Muslims, and that's a good thing. But I think it also there has to be sensitivity to the fact that many evangelicals, many conservative Christians of various kinds, feel they don't have a voice or a home on the Democratic side, and that's not right. Conscience is conscience, and it doesn't mean, again, that everybody wins their claim, but it means that we take them seriously. So I think the Democratic side needs to do much more to say, look, religious liberty, religious freedom is as important a principle to us as the other principles, core principles we're standing for as a party.
It seems to me that some of the events of the past year or two have helped to redefine the term worst-case scenario. So for just a minute, tell us about how the situation could get even worse if there's no concerted effort to make it better.
Well, I think the worst-case scenario is that religious freedom becomes a code phrase for bigotry. Mm-hmm. And for many Americans already, that's becoming the case. If in some circles, if you say religious freedom or that you're part of the Religious Freedom Center, they immediately wonder whether you're, out there to discriminate, to take away rights, to limit civil rights for people. That is really tragic. So I think that's the worst-case scenario. On the other side, the worst-case scenario is that we move forward with the good things that we want to do, equality for all, particularly LGBT people, protecting rights, but we lose an investment in our protecting our religious diversity, our role of faith in public life, being vigorous and welcome. That's not the country we want in the future. We don't want to kind of sanitize public square where a religion-free zone public square. That's not America either. We're not France. We're not other countries where it's difficult to be religious in the public square. So, the dangers on both sides are that we move away from the kind of country we want to be. I'm not saying we were ever this country fully. It's a story. It's a struggle. But it's our vision. Our vision is a level playing field for everybody. And the fear I have is that we're going to lose commitment to religious freedom because people are giving religious freedom a bad name. Religious freedom is not bigotry. It's not. Shouldn't be another way of discriminating. Can we uphold non-discrimination and also protect religious liberty? Absolutely we can do that. Will one side or the other win everything? No. But we have to sit together and figure out how we can do this together and try to live with one another across differences and uphold both principles.
Charles, I think you and I have talked about this many, many times, that in a social change movement of any kind, one of the strategies is stealing the vocabulary or redefining words that have had one meaning through history up until now and now are taking on another meaning. I think that is precisely where we are with religious freedom. And you said that during the campaigns, everybody's talking about the importance of religious freedom, but not everybody means the religious freedom the same way. And how do we get back to the kind of religious freedom that we find in the United States Constitution and that has been a part of this nation for centuries, so that we can say, I am for religious freedom as it's found in the Constitution, or I am against that? But it would be better, in my view, if we said we have a debate on what's right and what's wrong about this, rather than saying, we all believe in religious freedom. How do we get back to that?
Well, I think that we take a page from what Utah did not long ago. Not to say that's the model for everyone in this substance, but in the way they did it, the state of Utah, where the LDS Church, which is, of course, the prevailing religion in Utah, Equality Utah, which is the LGBT leading group in Utah, government officials who are very conservative Republicans by and large in the legislature, came together. They sat together. And they said, we need to work this out. We're Americans. Mm-hmm. And the principles of religious liberty and non-discrimination are framing principles for us. Let's agree on these principles and find a way, if we can, to do this, work this out. So it's a real-life case study for how we could do this in different states. If people and they worked it out, and they got the so-called Utah Compromise is actually a really good example where you have a religious liberty bill that does a lot to protect religious liberty in Utah in a way that's peculiar to Utah mm-hmm. law, but nevertheless protects, and non-discrimination for LGBT people in housing and in the workplace, which is kind of basic, right? Yeah. So in other states, though, when they do these kinds of things, they fight. One side says, well, look, we want religious freedom exemptions. We don't like same-sex marriage. We want religious freedom exemptions from this, and this, and then we're not going to pass any legislation to protect LGBT rights in housing or workplace, and we're not doing that. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a non-starter, and that's not a religious freedom model. That's not an American model. And if that's the way the lines are drawn, then people are going to just increasingly stop supporting religious freedom. The American people are not going to most of us are not going to support, a zero-sum game where one side wins all. And on the other side, in so-called blue states, I think it's important when LGBT rights are affirmed and protected that they think, well, how can we make sure that where appropriate and possible we protect religious conscience? Mm-hmm. Not in a way that would and take away the rights of anyone, but how can we find ways to signal that we respect religious conscience? I think Utah showed, which is a tough state to tackle this, they showed, speaking together, working together, we can do this. Mm-hmm. And the arrangement in religious freedom and the principles in the First Amendment are the best ground rules in the world for doing this. We just need to use them in a way that's fair and not as a bludgeon against the other side.
The way you answered that question is precisely the reason that listeners to State of Belief Radio ought to know the Religious Freedom Center very well and appreciate what's going on in the Newseum there and the programs that are being sponsored by your creative and prophetic work. Just briefly, say a word or two about the programs at the Religious Freedom Center that might be helpful to voters as they get ready for November 8th.
Sure. Thank you, Weldon. That's very kind. We are at the Newseum, as people may know who visit Washington. We're right between the White House and the Capitol. And though we are a museum about the First Amendment and the five freedoms, we're also home to a number of centers. And the Religious Freedom Center is the growing, vibrant center here now, and we are doing many things that offering many resources for Americans to learn about all sides of these issues. So we, of course, don't litigate. We don't lobby. We don't take sides in the political arena, but we do educate, and we convene people from all sides. And we like to think of ourselves as honest brokers for these conversations. And so we offer on our website, religiousfreedomcenter.org, we offer a range of resources, consensus guidelines for how to deal with religion in public schools, the pamphlet we did with you, Weldon, What is the Truth About American Muslims, that Interfaith Alliance worked with us on, and just a host of resources that people can use in their communities. We also offer courses. We're a school for religious freedom now, and for religious leaders in communities and for emerging religious leaders, people who, or people of secular groups that want a grounding in religious freedom principles. We offer graduate-level courses. They are blended learning, so they are mostly online, and you can get credit through various institutions and seminaries and so forth. But the in-person part, 3 days here at the Newseum, is really critical because we bring together cohorts of people from many different faith traditions, some who have no religious affiliation, to learn from and with one another. So, we're very ambitious here. We think that for the long term, beyond the culture wars, beyond the November election, for the long term, we need to educate future leadership about these founding principles that you've asked about and we've talked about during this time.
Charles Haynes is the founding director of the Religious Freedom Center at the Newseum in Washington, D.C., where he serves as vice president. His article headlined Republicans, Democrats, and the Stakes for Religious Freedom, and we'll link to that from stateofbelief.com. Charles, as always, it's great to visit with you. It's great to learn from you, and thank you for taking the time to be with us once more on State of Belief Radio.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such a privilege to always be with you, Weldon.